We spend hours every single day scrolling through feeds, letting recommendation engines curate our politics, our reading lists, and our worldview. We remain comfortable thinking we are actually making choices.
Yeah, we think because our thumb is doing the swiping, we are the ones in control.
But we aren't.
Yeah, if you look at the structure of the modern internet, its architecture, you realize that we are actually through the internet dismantling what's the core foundation of what makes us human, that is our autonomy. And in this episode, we will be drawing upon the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant for understanding the complexity of our autonomy in the age of algorithm.
Yes, we'll get to Kant real soon, but before that, let us address an interesting but tricky concept, that of informed consent. In any applied ethics class, we spend a lot of time on Tom Beauchamp and the classic liberal model of informed consent. So, informed consent is an autonomous choice without external interference, and B, it is a choice which is validated by prevailing social rules. So we like to think that because we clicked I agree on a terms of services pop-up, we have autonomously consented to the algorithm.
Which is exactly the legal defense the tech companies use, right? They argue that you are a rational agent who chose to legally download the app and decided to stay on it.
Right. But feminist philosophers have been dismantling that exact definition of consent for decades. Susan Sherwin, for example, she points out that Beauchamp's model of consent is fundamentally flawed because it assumes a level playing field. But Sherwin argues that true consent is impossible if you ignore massive power asymmetries and systemic vulnerability.
Yeah, there is perhaps no greater power asymmetry than a single human nervous system up against $1 trillion supercomputer.
Exactly. So the algorithm completely bypasses your rational consent. It doesn't present you with a fair choice. It manipulates your biology with outrage and slot machine mechanics. So, well, this is the Anticlockwise. I am Ashmita, and alongside Shubhendu, we have been exploring the philosophy of slowness as a mode of resistance against the onslaught on our attention, memory, autonomy, and so on.
Yeah, and let's make it clear, we are not talking about slowness just as a lifestyle aesthetics, but we're talking about slowness as a sort of philosophical and even biological prerequisite against the onslaught of the algorithm as a defense of human autonomy against it. And this episode is not all doom or all caution. At the end of the video, we will talk about how Kant actually offers us resources that we can use to reorient the internet as a slow and intentional space. By the way, there is a really interesting book by Elie Pariser, I think it's titled The Filter Bubble, that talks about the impact of social media, not only on personal attention, but social polarization and so on.
Yeah, there's been research that algorithms ensure that rage bait or inflammatory content gets maximum visibility just to keep the engagement in, right?
Yeah, I mean, Kant has actually a very precise vocabulary for this state of being overpowered when people just kind of echo the same sentiment and the fact that algorithm brings out the worst in us. He makes a crucial distinction between autonomy and heteronomy. So for Kant, if you are acting on your any kind of biological basis, like your instinct or desire, inclinations, or in our case, perhaps the dopamine hit, then you are not acting freely. You are operating in a state of heteronomy. Your will is being determined by an external force.
Yeah, which is also basically what Sherwin and other philosophers on relational autonomy have been warning us about. We are relational creatures. Our capacity for free will and consent is built through environments and our relationships with others, right? The algorithm weaponizes this. It takes our deep human need for connection and traps it inside a feedback loop designed solely to generate ad revenue.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the algorithm reduces the human subject to a predictable object, to a data point.
Yeah. If the machine's primary weapon of coercion is velocity, then slowness is our only mechanism that allows you to reclaim your status as a subject. True Kantian deliberation requires one thing, that is time. To understand why slowness is our only defense, we have to look at how a machine thinks compared to how a human thinks.
Yeah, and that is exactly why we have to dive into Kantian epistemology. Kant revolutionized philosophy by splitting knowledge into two distinct categories, a posteriori and a priori, in his critique of pure reason. We need to know these categories to understand the moral problem of AI, because in Kant, ethics is fundamentally related to knowledge. So his theory of knowledge is directly related to his theory of the morals, and both of them combine to explain how we understand the world.
Okay, what are they?
So a posteriori is strictly empirical. It literally means a posteriori after the fact. It comes entirely after experience. So we know that the stuff is hot after we have touched it, for example. But Kant argued that human beings are not just a collection of empirical facts. That he would differ from empiricists like John Locke, and he would say that we have a priori structures of reason within us that actually helps us sort of process the empirical experience into intelligible knowledge. And things like space, time, and causality, those are a priori structures that are within us.
Yeah, but think about what happens when we outsource that organizing power to artificial intelligence. An AI recommendation engine, no matter how advanced it seems, is apparently entirely 100% a posteriori.
Did you do the actual experiment with
Yes,
some AI
I
chatbots?
did actually. Yeah. I asked Gemini and Grok. Both of them said that they were a posteriori. Grok was kind of proud of it and implied that even humans might be a posteriori thinking machines in today's world, right? Rather than AI getting smarter than us humans, which is, the science fictional fear, I think the real danger is humans getting dumber and as dumb as the AI in some ways. It has no AI has no a priori intuition. It has no, so to speak, internal soul, no independent reason. However, it mimics reason without having any intuition in the Kantian sense, right?
Yeah, that's the most profound epistemological horror that AI introduces to our world. So we have built these machines which can perfectly mimic the reason, Kantian reason, but without having any intuition inside. So there is no intuitive a priori structure to process the vast amount of a posteriori data that is fed to us, that it continuously is taking from us. So it's almost like, imagine a story where there is this coils and coils of the narrative, but there is no narrator. What kind of story would that be?
Yeah, that would be horrific for sure. There is absolutely nobody home inside this seemingly rational structure of AI. How horrific is that?
Which is exactly why the algorithm demands speed, because it treats us as a data point. It does not allow our brain to process the data. So we only rely on our immediate reflexes, on our sensations. And we don't have any time to activate our a priori organizing power, which is our understanding.
But Shubhendu, in an ideal world, if the algorithms were not simply, there for mining our attention, could AI be Kantian moral agents? We can kind of imagine that AI can be fed instructions on being truthful, for example, and it would, because it is a machine, it would perfectly execute that command, right?
Yeah, that is actually a really great question. And to answer that, actually, we'll have to go directly to Kant's groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. In it, Kant establishes the highest moral law, which he calls the categorical imperative. And I will have to quote here Kant because I cannot put it myself in the same way as how beautifully he puts it. So Kant says, and I quote, "There is therefore only a single categorical imperative, and it is this: act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it became a universal law," unquote. So basically, a moral agent is someone who can take their subjective personal maxim and rationally universalize it as a law. Or you can also interpret it even more simple terms, like you want to treat someone in the same way that you want to be treated. Now, this moral agent is not following the law because they are following a command. they need to discover the law freely through a reason within them.
Question. Well, how does Kant make sure that this moral agent is not a vigilante who is imposing his will on others?
Yeah, I mean, the Kantian agent is obviously not someone like Batman who would think himself above the law and use procedures like intimidation for so-called greater good, because he would not want to be treated like that himself. So, in Kant, everyone should have access to an equal amount of autonomy. For instance, if a enslaver argues that he has the right of property over a slave because he believes the slave cannot take care of themselves, he is violating the categorical imperative, because he is not allowing the same right of having freedom over his own body and property to the enslaved.
Yeah, in Kant, freedom and reason are intrinsically linked, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Freedom is the capacity to act according to laws that reason gives to itself, which is the autonomy, rather than being determined by external forces or individual desires, which causes heteronomy, which is the biggest risk of the algorithm-driven world, as we have discussed.
Yeah, but some tech philosophers like Powers, Thomas M. Powers, claims that we can just program this top-down approach into an AI, so then a machine would actually be the perfect Kantian agent because it doesn't have emotions that get in the way. So in that sense, AIs can seem more rational.
No, but that completely misreads Kant. So Kant specifically argues that an action has moral worth only if it is done from duty through the exercise of reason. And let me again, quote Kant from Groundwork. That should make the point clearer. And I quote: "An action from duty has its moral worth not in the purpose to be attained by it, but the maxim in accordance with which it is decided upon." Unquote. So the maxim needs to be decided by the moral agent. It cannot be programmed or it cannot be given as a command. And that's what a machine cannot do. A machine cannot decide to act from duty. It just executes a function. Yeah, and I should also give a disclaimer, since we're talking about Kant and slavery, that Kant initially starts with very racist views. He's of the human races, which is an essay from the 1770s. He has a deterministic view of only certain races having reason and different races being determined there by their geography and biology, to his later writings where he kind of puts freedom and dignity as central to his philosophy. That does not make him perhaps like a huge racial egalitarian, but nevertheless we need to recognize this capacity for revision, which is also very central to humanity and central to philosophy, which the machine totally lacks, because it traps you in your past. Whatever you have already done, that's what defines you. But for humans, it's your capacity to do something different. That's what defines a human, I think.
Yeah, right. So a machine doesn't have a will, and it certainly doesn't have the capacity for a priori intuitive reasoning. So it also cannot have any moral duty. Right?
Yeah, it cannot have any moral duty or even any kind of sense of morality at all, I think, because an action is not moral because of its purpose, because what it is goal. So how so much great that purpose might appear. Even in fascism, people might think that they are being purpose driven, doing something for the greater good, etc. An action is moral in Kant only when it is in accordance with the reason that is inside us, and that we need to activate each time we make an ethical choice. So it's also very singular. You cannot just have a general sort of morality. It's more singular.
So basically, if we sum it up, the problem of something like, say, fascism is that people become like automatons. They sure rationalize their actions, but they do not activate the process of reasoning.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. And, people start acting like the AI is basically. So that is the greatest threat of the algorithm, I think. It creates a world of unfreedom precisely because everyone is acting on impulse through heteronomy. There is no time for a priori thought, and they're echoing each other's actions without much of thought or reason, much like the automatons.
So technically, there is no growth as such.
Yeah, there is no growth and there is no capacity for change or for doing something which is really free.
Yeah, I think Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment, makes this intrinsic link between reason and freedom very clearly. And it is a short essay, very easy in some ways.
Yeah, it's a really important one. So that's one side of the moral problem of the AI, that it does not have a moral duty. But there is another aspect of it, and Kant again talks about it in the Groundwork. So the AI cannot have reason or true reasoning or true morality because it does not have any personal desires either. For Kant, in the human being, the activation of moral duty requires a sort of a grueling internal struggle between our messy biological inclinations and the objective moral law. And Kant calls this the natural dialectic.
Yes, can you elaborate how Kant describes that struggle?
Yeah, so Kant writes again in Groundwork, and I'm quoting again, now reason issues its precepts unremittingly, without thereby promising anything to the inclinations. But from this there arises a natural dialectic, unquote. So actually, the natural dialectic is what differentiates moral philosophy from just common sense. It works as a filter or as a sieve to establish the authority of the categorical imperative as moral duty.
Yes, that quote is actually everything. That natural dialectic is precisely what the algorithm lacks. It doesn't struggle between inclinations and intuitive moral law, but we as humans, we do.
Exactly. Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So AI is problematic on these both grounds of the reason as well as desire, and because it thinks that we are just an aggregate of the past cliques. So we are sort of in a cage where no autonomy is possible, and that is not how human beings work. So actually, there is another important aspect of this whole issue is that Kant designates the categorical imperative and the capacity to find moral law within us as the synthetic a priori, which is a pretty complex concept. A synthetic proposition creates something entirely new. It isn't just a recycling of the past. It's not, the predicate is not contained in the subject. It's a creative organizing leap. As moral agents, we are taking this leap. We are actively creating or organizing or empirical reality.
Yeah. We should have a full episode untangling the complexity of it. Yeah. It definitely relates to the problem of using AI as a cognitive tool. For example, before I go to the party, I may ask the AI to help me choose a dress. I am making the AI perform a cognitive function. Now, can the AI use its own taste and tell me what looks better?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really fascinating example. It complicates things further because, it brings in the question of AI and taste. AI can only aggregate again data from, what is considered a good wardrobe choice, which is again done by people already. So it's made of the past. And it can never arrive at your unique taste because for Kant, taste is both sort of subjective but at the same time universal, and algorithm cannot predict that.
Yeah, the algorithm is not never truly synthetic. If the algorithm shows that you binge watched the entire new season of Bridgerton over the weekend, it will perfectly predict that by Tuesday you will click on a 40-minute video on the Bridgerton cast apparently trying fries for the first time in all their royal regalia, whatever.
So much better example than Kant could ever think of. The synthetic categories extend the knowledge. So Kant is also arguing that we are in some sense expanding knowledge about ourselves when we are acting as autonomous moral agents. Therefore, autonomy cannot be programmed.
Right, that makes sense. When we are trapped in a high-speed doom scroll, a posteriori loop, as Kant would call it, we cannot be autonomous. But when we physically put the phone down, walk away, and pick up a physical book, that is a synthetic leap. That's when we broke the algorithmic prediction and created a new moral reality.
So yeah, I mean, slowness is the best thing that you can do for your autonomy and consent because everything is structured by the velocity, the heteronomic velocity of the algorithm. And slowness is also the best thing you can do for resisting the memory crisis that is plaguing us now. Our previous episode on Aristotle, Hannah Arendt, and Milan Kundera discusses that.
Yeah. To rebuild the autonomous subject, that is to escape the a posteriori prison of the black box, we have to linger and make time fragrant, as we discussed in our episode on Byung-Chul Han. The machine only knows your past and it wants to use speed to trap you there. Slowness is how you can reclaim the future.
Yeah, and I think actually that reclamation is possible in an ideal internet world if we really make our interactions slow and intentional. I will again quote Kant, forgive me. So he gives a really memorable version or vision of the moral community, or what he calls the kingdom of ends. In the Groundwork, Kant defines the kingdom of ends as a world where we treat each other as autonomous, rational agents with dignity and mutual respect.
Not as a means to generate revenue.
Yes, and that's what the internet can be still, I think.
Yeah, in any case, now let's end on that note. And that is truly possible if we start acting with deliberation and reason on the internet. So until next time,
Stay
anti-clockwise.